You see that?
Well, I think there's partly a misunderstanding of God, that it's easy to find views of God which are morally abhorrent. I mean, for example, I would think that a God who sends the majority of the world's population to hell forever is morally abhorrent, and I think there shouldn't be such a God, and I think there isn't such a God. So you've got to discriminate between religious views. But if you think, as Christians are supposed to think, and I think Jews and Muslims are supposed to think too, that God is ultimately a God of mercy and a God of forgiveness and a God even of love, positive concern for the well-being of everything God has created, then I don't see how that could be thought of as morally objectionable. At least on the moral point of view, it would be good if there was such a God.
But the argument is there isn't. The more we discover about science and the way things work, the more we explain things that used to have to be explained by a God of these gaps, which we don't need anymore.
Scientists would say all sorts of things, of course,
sure.
and there are some scientists who would say what you have just said. And I think there's a real question to ask about, well, by strictly scientific methods, would you expect to discover anything about God? So I'm not impressed by the argument that God is superfluous to science. It's like saying God is superfluous to car mechanics. I mean, well, God is, yes. But there might be questions which might be relevant, but they're not strictly scientific questions. They're questions of value, really, not about questions of scientifically ascertainable fact. So the fact that God is scientifically superfluous is not, to me, an objection. It's an obvious fact.
Keith argues for God as a believer who is a philosopher. I'd like to hear how a believer who is a scientist argues about God. I go to Harvard to meet Owen Gingrich, Emeritus Professor of Astronomy and the History of Science. Owen is a leading expert on Copernicus's epoch-making book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, which he is delighted to show me.
This was a popular almanac which was went through repeated editions in the 16th century. It happened to have the first English translation of part of Copernicus's book in it.
Owen believes in God. How does he integrate his science with his religion?
Owen, how can you advise me to begin to address this question about God and the possible existence?
Well, first off, I don't think science can give any proofs for the existence of God or for the non-existence of God. These issues are deep ones, they're metaphysical, they're related to the entire framework in which the universe itself sits. If you think of God as not only creator, but sustainer of the universe, then this framework itself would not exist if it were not for God's ongoing action.
So what I hear from this is that if I want to think about God, I'm limiting God by thinking of God only as a creator.
I would say that is a very important theological underpinning. But if we take seriously the statement in the first chapter of Genesis that God created mankind, humankind, in his own image, and ask what that means, I would say it must have something to do with creativity itself, with self-consciousness, and with conscience. I look at big issues around the time of Galileo, where a proof text was used against the Copernican heliocentric system. Psalm 104, the Lord God laid the foundation of the earth that it not be moved forever. I mean, I've asked my students, can they think of an interpretation of that verse? And to my astonishment, they were baffled. But Kepler had it right. He said that verse is talking about the stability of the earth as a home for humankind. It is It is a place that is satisfactory for life to inhabit. It has nothing to do with celestial mechanics. But I would think that in order to understand God, one has to understand God with a human vocabulary, even though that is so foreign to what God may be like.
I feel the power of Owen's God as the sustainer of the universe, which is even more fundamental than as its creator. I'd like to talk to someone whose mission in life is to argue for God's existence. William Lane Craig is my man. With doctorates in philosophy and theology, he debates atheists wherever he finds them. Bill, can the existence of God be demonstrated?
Well, it all depends on what you mean, obviously, by demonstrated. I don't think there's a mathematically certain proof of God's existence that will compel belief. But I do think that there are good arguments for God's existence. That is to say, I think there are arguments that God exists that have true premises that are more plausible than their opposites and that logically imply the conclusion that there is a God. So I think there are good reasons to believe that God exists.
What are some of these reasons, and how would you follow the argument?
Let me just list them without explaining them. One would be, I think, that God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists rather than nothing. Another one would be that God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe at a point in the finite past. Another would be that God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. Another would be that God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world. I would also argue that God is the best explanation for the historical facts surrounding the person of Jesus of Nazareth, particularly his radical personal claims, his miracles, and his resurrection from the dead. There's the famous teleological argument, which would say that the universe exhibits a complexity in its structure that cannot be attributed plausibly to either chance or to physical necessity, and that therefore this is best explained by saying it's the product of intelligent design. I would also think that the very concept of God, once it's properly understood, entails that God exists, such that it's metaphysically impossible for God not to exist. And then finally, I would say that it's possible to have a personal relationship with God and to know God personally. And that latter isn't really an argument for God's existence, it's the claim that you can know God exists wholly apart from arguments simply by having a personal and intimate relationship with God the Creator.
And if you integrate all of these together, how would you describe the level of confidence that someone should have having all of that together?
I think it provides a good cumulative case that would be convincing in a court of law, for example, that it makes the existence of God more probable than not.
I like Bill's systematic approach to God's existence, laying out each argument with precision, if not with proof. I'm surrounded by theists. I need to cross over to the other side.